So if you try to imagine the ultimate ancient biblical feast, right?
Hmm.
You're probably picturing like a roaring fire, a whole roasted lamb, maybe this massive banquet hall filled with exotic meats.
Oh, for sure. That's the classic, Hollywood image of the ancient world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you actually go all the way back to the very first meal that's ever mandated in the biblical text, that roasted lamb, it would have been a massive violation of the rule,
Whole violation.
which is wild. So today we are taking a deep dive into the complete biblical menu. We're looking strictly at what the original source texts tell us these ancient people actually ate, how they ate it, and the really complex rules that govern their tables.
And well, looking at that very first meal is really the perfect place to start because the original biblical diet, as it's laid out in the first chapter of Genesis, was entirely, and I mean completely plant-based.
Wait, really? Just plants?
Just plants. In the Garden of Eden, humanity is handed this very specific menu. The text states that God gave them every herb-bearing seed and every tree-yielding seed. Yeah, that is it. Herbs, seeds, and fruit. It was essentially a completely vegetarian mandate right out of the gate.
That is fascinating because, it means the baseline design in the text wasn't carnivorous at all.
Right, not at all.
But obviously that rule changes, because reading further into these ancient texts, meat becomes this massive part of the sacrificial system.
Yeah.
And the daily diet. So, what triggers the shift?
So the shift actually happens after the flood. In Genesis chapter 9, Noah is given this universal permission that just, it fundamentally alters the human relationship with animals.
Okay, what does it say?
The text says, "Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you. Even as the green herb have I given you all things."
Hang on, let's stop right there. Because going from a garden to, a global meat buffet changes the entire dynamic of how humans live.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge pivot.
Right. It's no longer just gathering, it's hunting, it's domesticating. We go from a strict diet of seeds and fruit to literally an all-you-can-eat buffet of every moving animal on Earth.
Yeah, it's total universal permission at that point.
So practically speaking then, when this new agricultural and pastoral society actually settled down, what were the foundational staples? If I'm walking through an ancient market in the text, what am I actually buying?
Well, to get the clearest picture of those staples, you have to look over at the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8.
Okay.
Moses provides this list of what you might almost call the promised land superfoods, The text explicitly describes the good land as a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees.
Oh, wow.
And pomegranates. Plus, it specifically mentions olive oil and honey.
Wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. Those are incredibly durable, energy-dense foods.
Very much so. They store really well.
But there has to be a huge difference between what ordinary people consumed on a daily basis just to survive and what the elites were eating, right?
Oh, night and day.
Because if everyday survival was just lentils and bread, how did leaders project power? In the ancient world, power wasn't just gold. Power was like calories.
That is exactly the right way to look at it. Everyday meals were highly practical, heavily reliant on legumes and grains.
Just the basics.
Right. You see this really vividly in Genesis 25. Esau comes in from the field and he's just exhausted and faint.
Oh, famous bowl of stew.
Exactly. Jacob hasn't prepared some multi-course banquet. He's literally made a pottage of lentils, lentil stew and bread. Because legumes were the absolute foundation of ancient survival.
Because they store forever.
Right. They store for years without rotting, and they provide dense protein.
And, Esau traded his entire birthright for that bowl of lentils, which honestly says a lot about the brutal reality of ancient physical labor.
It really does.
You don't trade your inheritance unless you are operating on a razor's edge of caloric deficit.
Yeah.
And we see something similar with military logistics in these texts too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like when David is on the run in the wilderness.
Right. The text actually lists his supply drops.
It does. In 2 Samuel, David's supporters bring him survival rations. And the text lists wheat, barley, flour, parched corn, beans, lentils, honey, butter, sheep, and cheese of kine.
Okay, cheese of kine. Just to clarify the terminology for anyone listening, kine is just an archaic English word for cattle. So we were talking about cow's cheese.
Exactly.
And parched corn just means roasted grain, right?
Yeah, just dry roasted grain.
So it's basically the ancient equivalent of military MREs like meals ready to eat. Hard cheese, roasted grains, dried beans.
Purely utilitarian.
Right, designed to travel in the heat without spoiling. But What happens when we look at the absolute opposite end of the spectrum? Like, how did kings show off?
The scale of a royal feast in these texts is, it's genuinely staggering. Just take King Solomon's daily provision, which is detailed in 1 Kings chapter 4.
Okay.
Keep in mind, this isn't a special holiday banquet. This is just the daily requirement to maintain his royal court.
Just a random Tuesday.
Right. He required 30 measures of fine flour, 60 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture oxen, and 100 sheep.
Right.
Plus harts, roebucks, fallow deer, and fatted fowl. Every single day.
Let's actually do the math on that.
Yeah.
100 sheep a day. That is over 36,000 sheep a year, plus 30 oxen a day.
It's unbelievable volume.
The sheer logistical nightmare of sourcing and feeding and butchering and cooking that much meat in the ancient Near East is mind-boggling.
You'd need an entire localized economy just for the kitchen.
Exactly. Thousands of shepherds, massive pastures, just to feed the palace. That isn't just a meal, that is a macroeconomic statement of total regional dominance.
It projects absolute security and wealth.
Yeah.
But, even on a smaller, more personal scale, hospitality in the ancient text demanded really intense generosity.
Like with Abraham.
Yeah, Genesis 18. When Abraham has those angelic visitors, he doesn't serve them leftover lentil pottage. He immediately tells Sarah to knead 3 measures of fine meal into cakes. And then he literally runs to the herd, fetches a tender, good calf, and serves it to them alongside butter and milk.
So there's this massive emphasis on giving the absolute best you have, the finest flour, the tenderest calf.
Always the best.
But if we take a step back, this creates a really compelling question. Because we discussed earlier that Noah was told he could eat every moving thing.
Universal permission, yeah.
Right, universal permission. Yet anyone familiar with the biblical text knows that rule absolutely did not last. Suddenly, whole categories of animals are just banned.
Right, a massive restriction.
So if everyday survival was hard enough with lentils and parched corn, why do we get to a place where you're banned from eating half the animals on Earth?
It's arguably the most defining shift in the text. You move from that universal permission in Genesis 9 straight into the intensely strict dietary laws of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14.
So what's the purpose of that gap?
What's happening is the creation of a distinct, separated people. The diet becomes a physical, inescapable boundary line between what is common and what is holy.
Okay, so the diet wasn't like an ancient health protocol. It was essentially a physical uniform.
That's a great way to put it.
Just like a soldier wears a uniform on the outside to show allegiance, they were eating a specific diet to wear their allegiance on the inside. It made assimilation with neighboring cultures almost impossible.
Precisely. Because if you cannot share a meal with your neighbors because their food is an abomination to you, you can't easily intermarry,
Yeah, you can't easily forge casual alliances over dinner.
Exactly. It forces separation. And the biological specifics they had to look for to maintain this uniform are incredibly strict.
What were the rules for the land animals?
For any land animal to be considered clean and acceptable to eat, it had to meet 2 absolute criteria. It had to part the hoof, meaning it was cloven-footed, and it had to chew the cud.
Wait, why hooves and digestion? I mean, is there a biological reason there, like disease prevention, or is it purely a symbolic test of obedience?
Well, theologians and historians debate this constantly, but textually it aligns heavily with symbolism.
Okay, how so?
A fully divided hoof is a constant physical representation of division, separating the clean from the unclean.
Oh, that makes sense.
And chewing the cud, which is rumination, is a characteristic of peaceful grazing animals like sheep and oxen. They aren't predators, they're distinct from wild carnivorous beasts.
Right.
But the absolute key here is that an animal had to possess both traits.
It had to do both. You couldn't just have one out of 2.
Exactly. The text explicitly rules out animals that only meet one of the criteria. Take the camel, for instance.
Okay.
The text notes that the camel chews the cud, but it doesn't divide the hoof, so it's unclean.
Gotcha.
Conversely, the swine, or the pig, it has a completely divided cloven hoof, but it does not chew the cud. Therefore, it's an abomination to eat.
Which is huge, right? Because that specifically set them apart from neighboring Canaanite and Philistine cultures, where pork was a major dietary staple.
Exactly. It drew a hard cultural line.
So it's completely binary. You check both boxes or you're off the table. Does that strict dual requirement logic apply to seafood as well?
Yes, it does. For anything in the waters, whether it's seas or rivers, it had to have both fins and scales.
Both again.
Both. If it lacked either, you couldn't eat it, which immediately eliminates all shellfish, crabs, lobsters, eels, catfish, all of that.
Okay, so we've covered the cattle and the fish, but I have to ask about the outliers. Because
Yeah.
in any ancient text, there's always something that makes a modern reader do a double take.
Oh, definitely.
What is the absolute weirdest or most surprising acceptable food on this biblical menu?
So there is a very specific, highly surprising exception in Leviticus 11 regarding insects.
Insects.
Yeah. While the text states that almost all creeping things that fly are an abomination, leaping insects are clean.
Like bugs are clean.
Specific bugs, the text explicitly says you may eat the locust after his kind, and the bald locust after his kind, and the beetle after his kind, and the grasshopper after his kind.
Hold on, that feels like a massive contradiction. I mean, if the goal is separation and holiness, how does eating a grasshopper fit into that?
Right, it sounds strange to us.
Was this just like an ancient pragmatic loophole for famine survival? Or is there a textual reason leaping bugs get a pass?
It really is largely tied to survival and agricultural reality. Locusts are swarming insects that devastate crops, right?
Right.
So if a locust swarm destroyed your wheat and barley, those essential staples we talked about earlier, the locusts themselves became the only remaining source of dense protein.
Oh, wow.
They were perfectly acceptable to consume, but textually they are distinct from creatures that slither or drag their bellies in the dirt, which were entirely condemned.
Okay, that makes perfect sense, actually. If they eat your crop, you eat them. It's basically ancient pest control disguised as lunch.
Exactly.
Now, beyond the types of animals you could eat, are there restrictions on how the food was processed once you caught it?
Yes, and these are absolutely non-negotiable. There was a recurring, uncompromising ban on eating blood and on eating the fat of sacrificial animals.
So no rare steaks.
Definitely not. Leviticus 3 and 17 make this incredibly clear. The fat belonged to the Lord as an offering, and the blood. The text states, the life of the flesh is in the blood.
Right.
It was reserved solely for making atonement on the altar.
Let's define atonement in this context real quick for the listener. Atonement essentially means covering a debt or reconciling a relationship. So the blood represents the literal life force of the creature.
Exactly. The text is basically saying that life is sacred. It forces the eater to acknowledge the cost of the life they are consuming.
You couldn't just casually slaughter an animal in the field and have a barbecue.
No, you had to carefully drain the blood and pour it out like water on the earth. It turns the very act of eating meat into this profound, almost heavy responsibility. It requires reverence.
Which is the exact opposite of the, mindless consumption we are so used to today. You really can't separate the meal from the mortality of the animal.
It grounds you completely.
Which actually brings us to an interesting practical question. If someone listening to this deep dive wanted to start eating more biblically, based strictly on the text, not like modern diet trends, but the actual ancient literature, how do they even begin? What are the first steps?
Well, if you're looking strictly at the text, prioritizing a biblical diet means leaning heavily into those celebrated staples we discussed in Deuteronomy.
The superfoods.
Right, whole grains, specifically barley and wheat, a heavy reliance on the legumes like the lentils and beans Jacob and David relied on, plus the rich seasonal fruits, figs, raisins, grapes, and pomegranates. And for fats, using pure olive oil and organic dairy fats like butter and the cheese of kine.
It's remarkably simple, really. It's essentially just stripping away the heavy processing and returning to durable, foundational ingredients.
Exactly. Very simple, very grounded.
But I mean, we cannot talk about biblical eating without talking about the most famous, iconic food in the entire ancient text.
Ah, yes.
Bread from heaven.
Exodus 16 gives us the complete breakdown of manna. It sustained the entire population through the wilderness.
But what was it actually like mechanically? Like, does the text describe the texture and the taste?
It does, in really striking detail. It describes manna physically as a small, round thing, as small as the hoarfrost on the ground.
Okay.
It looked like coriander seed, it was white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey.
Wafers made with honey. I mean, that genuinely sounds like a morning pastry. It sounds delicious.
Right.
But the rules governing manna were psychologically brutal, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely.
Because it wasn't just free food, it was a test.
It was an intense psychological test. They were told to gather only what they needed for that specific day, exactly an omer per person.
And just for context, an omer is about 2 liters, so roughly enough to fill a standard modern mixing bowl.
Right, and if they tried to hoard that omer, if they panicked and left it until the morning to ensure they had food for the next day, the text says it bred worms and stank.
Oh.
It rotted instantly. The only exception was the day before the Sabbath, where they were commanded to gather twice as much, and miraculously, it wouldn't spoil.
Let's really think about the psychological toll of that for a second. Imagine being a parent in a barren desert, right? Your basic biological instinct is to stockpile to protect your children from starvation by hoarding calories.
It's human nature.
Completely.
Yeah.
And the text actively forbids it. You literally couldn't stockpile your pantry. You had to go to sleep every single night with zero food in your tent, waking up every single morning just trusting that breakfast would miraculously be waiting on the ground.
Yeah, the sheer terror of those first few weeks must have been overwhelming
I can't even imagine.
because it required entirely breaking their human instinct for self-reliance. Which, honestly, brings us to the core meaning of food in this text. And really, this is the most important insight we can take away from this entire exploration of the biblical diet.
All right, I am ready. What's the major reframe?
In the biblical text, food is never just about physical sustenance. It is never just calories or fuel for the body or even a display of wealth. Food is the primary spiritual tool used to teach dependence and obedience.
The primary spiritual tool. How does the text actually prove that?
We see the ultimate proof in Deuteronomy chapter 8. Moses is recounting the 40 years in the wilderness, and he explicitly explains the underlying mechanism of why God gave them manna.
Okay.
The text says God humbled them and suffered them to hunger and fed them with manna, specifically that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live.
Man does not live by bread only. You know, we've all heard that phrase culturally, but hearing it in the context of the strict gathering rules and the rotting leftovers, it completely changes the meaning.
It really does.
The diet wasn't just a list of clean and unclean ingredients. God literally engineered their physical hunger and then provided this honey wafer bread on a strict 24-hour cycle just to train their minds and spirits.
Exactly. Every time they sat down to eat, whether it was manna in the wilderness or a pomegranate in the promised land, the food was a teacher. It was a mechanism for mindfulness. It forced them to acknowledge that they were not the architects of their own survival.
Man.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean for us today? How do we take these ancient texts, the strict rules of hooves and cud, the manna, the lentils, and actually apply that underlying principle to our modern lives this week?
I think a great practical takeaway for you listening is to try incorporating just one of those promised land staples into your diet this week.
I like that.
Go buy a pomegranate or cook a pot of lentil stew or use some really high quality olive oil. But don't just eat it. Eat it as a mindfulness exercise. Let the physical taste of that ancient staple connect you to the history and the thousands of years of humanity who survived on it.
I love that. And, I will add my own practical takeaway to that. Before your next meal, whatever it is, take a deliberate, intentional pause. Deuteronomy 8.10 has this beautiful command. It says, "When thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee." Use your meal this week as a moment of genuine gratitude. Acknowledge where the food came from, rather than just treating it as background noise in your day.
That changes the entire atmosphere of a meal. You transition from mindless consumption to intentional gratitude.
It really does. Well, we are going to continue this series in our next deep dive, looking even closer at these ancient texts. But I have to be honest, while I understand the agricultural pragmatism of it, I am absolutely going to skip the Leviticus-approved grasshoppers this week.
Yeah, probably a good call.
But I am definitely going to try snacking on some fresh figs and maybe some honeycomb.
I think that is a very safe and delicious place to start.
Same here. But before we go, consider this. If the ancient biblical text uses food as the ultimate tool to teach humans that they depend on a higher power, what does it mean for us today that we live in an era of absolute food abundance? When you can get a cheeseburger delivered to your door at 2 in the morning with a single tap on your phone, have we lost the one physical trigger that was originally designed to teach us humility? Something to chew on. We'll see you on the next deep dive.